Hey there, I'm Glenn Athy. Welcome to the Your Local Economy Forum series of podcasts and videos. There are 16 episodes which aim to introduce the theory and practice of local economic development. Before we begin, there are a number of guiding principles that we follow in this series. One is that economic development builds prosperous, inclusive communities that are sustainable. And another is that my mission is to help build great economic development organizations. This episode is episode 1 and it's part of series 1, which is about the foundations of local and regional economic development. So in episode 1, why are we concerned about local and regional economic development? What we'll discuss in this video is we'll go through some definitions of what economic growth and economic development is. We will discuss why should we be concerned, a brief history of the UK economy and policy in this area, some of the common issues that you may recognise that crop up in your working life in local economic development, how local economic development needs to go beyond orthodox economics, and we'll talk about competency in local economic development. First of all, we'll discuss a few definitions. There's a difference between economic growth and economic development. Economic growth is simply a measurement in the change of a country, region, or local area's output. Economic growth doesn't really tell us much about the distribution of growth in economic output or about the welfare of the people living in the locality or the region. Whereas economic development is actually concerned with the welfare or well-being of people in a region or locality, and also concerned with social progress such as education and health. And it also considers the distribution of welfare and wealth, who benefits. And critically, it considers the government, social, legal, market, and institutional system that supports the economy and economic welfare. And it also considers environmental and social sustainability. Well, in the UK, there are stark differences in the economic performance and social welfare of different local areas. For example, the annual percentage of nominal GVA growth over the 20-year period to 2022 varies enormously between local areas, we can see on the map on the left-hand side. And this is further reinforced by annual jobs growth in the map on the right-hand side. As we can see, some localities have experienced a contraction in jobs on average each year, and others have experienced a major expansion in jobs. When we look at GVA or economic output per head by local area, we can see massive disparities in the UK, and these have existed for the past 60 or 70 years, not just the past 20 years. And we have a measure of productivity on the map on the right-hand side, and that's GVA per hour worked. And we can see massive disparities in local areas in the UK. And a lot of the history of local and regional economic development goes back to the 1970s and 1980s. And the 1970s marked the end of a long period of economic expansion in the UK that followed the Second World War. There's a period of low economic growth and high inflation. This was particularly affected by oil prices rising fourfold between 1972 and 74, and the cost of industrial materials almost doubling. And what we saw was like huge manufacturing jobs decline by 2.1 million between 1971 and 1981. And UK government policy was preoccupied with macroeconomic policy. What regional policy that existed up to the 1970s was mostly about tax incentives, planning constraints, and advanced factories, trying to shift jobs and manufacturing out from hotspots in London and the southeast of England into northern regions. And the 1980s marked a massive change in the UK political economy due to political choices and the continued decline of manufacturing and industrial employment. We saw manufacturing jobs further decline by 1.2 million, and unemployment almost more than doubled between 1979 and 1984, from 1.5 million people to 3.3 million people. That's an unemployment rate of almost 12%. And we saw the rise in hidden unemployment. This was people who left the labour market, often declaring themselves permanently sick. And this became a major problem over the 1980s. By 1991, there were 1.6 million people out of the labour market. And the consequences were a doubling of the relative poverty rate. And many localities were in economic and social crisis. And their response was really that they had to do something in the absence of government policy providing answers and support. Funding started to become available in the European structural funds and also some local and urban funding. And in the 1990s, the government realised that they needed a more coherent approach to local and regional economic development, and they came up with more integrated grant programs and economic development programs. And then this extended into the 2000s with the establishment of English regional development agencies, which consolidated a lot of these local and regional development functions. And at the same time, in the devolved nations in the UK, that is Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, they had had economic development agencies since 1974. And this really did inform English regional policy at that time. And we also saw the rise of sub-regional economic partnerships and local authorities involved in economic development and regeneration. So into the 2010s, there was a major political change. Budgets were slashed for government and public expenditure, and for local and regional economic development. It was cut by 2/3. Regional development agencies were abolished. Some new institutions were designed to replace them, local enterprise partnerships, but they had a fraction of the budget and staff capacity. And we saw the resurgence of this multiple fragmented funds and grant system for local and regional economic development. And there has been a big debate about local and regional devolution and empowerment in terms of more policies, resources, and the ability to raise taxes and income. And this has progressed somewhat in places like Greater Manchester, but not to the extent which Michael Heseltine laid the blueprint for in his policy paper, No Stone Unturned, in 2011. In the 2020s, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, which had major economic impacts. And so far, we've had more change in government and policy. Local enterprise partnerships have now been abolished. European funds have been replaced by the Shared Prosperity Fund, but with less money. There was a very coherent policy statement in 2022 in the Levelling Up White Paper, which was more akin to a declaration of ambitions. But this big statement has not been matched by investment or a coherent plan across government. And it hasn't articulated how central government will work with local government to level up and address economic disparities. And so we've seen the continuation of competitive grant funds, mainly from capital expenditure. And in 2024, the year this video was made, we're facing many crises and challenges. Government policy has rarely been consistent or coherent for more than a few years at a time. And it's clear that past policies haven't worked particularly well. So in the future, we really need to improve policy, long-term consistency, stability, and some real empowerment and devolution to local areas. We're just going to look at some of the key issues that we deal with as local economic developers. One is about reacting to and dealing with the impacts of economic shocks and restructuring and decline. This could be high unemployment, poverty, industrial decline, or the outmigration of skilled workers. And there could be related to attempts to develop new paths to economic development and growth. And this could be attracting FDI and jobs, encouraging entrepreneurship and new business formation and business growth. It could be helping local industries apply new technologies, and it can be helping, upgrade infrastructure. Orthodox economics isn't very good at dealing with complex systems. An economy, whether it's a local, regional, or national economy, is a system comprised of many dynamic links. And economics is really a social institution and dynamic that is within a physical world. And if we see that, for example, any basic relationship like a city's labor market, it involves aspects of its own population, education, and economic activity and transport systems, and that beyond the city boundaries into the adjacent regions, and can also be influenced by things like housing policy and housing provision. This has been recognised in cities such as Bristol, who've adopted the UN Sustainable Development Goals as its strategic objectives, and also in initiatives such as the Anti and Robert M. Bass Centre for Transformative Placemaking, which looks at more holistically at what makes successful places and what processes and assets and factors need to be put in place. In the introduction, I mentioned that it's a mission of mine to help build great economic development organizations. In most of the videos and podcasts, I will reflect on this using what I call a scale of practice. This is based on my 30 years of professional experience working with local, city, and regional economic development organizations and teams. And what I mean by this is the ABCD of practice. Are you amateur, basic, competent, or dynamic? So are you A, B, C, or D? Are you an amateur economic development organization? You really just started your path. You've probably reacted to a crisis or situation. You may have been led by politics. If you're a beginner, you may have some basic elements of a service. You've probably copied these off other localities. You may have some network relationships and stakeholders, but you often take their views at face value. You don't critically analyze them. It tends to be led by politicians. If you're a competent economic development organization or team, you'll be using evidence to inform what you do, and you'll have some well thought out services and initiatives, and you're starting to think about the long term. You'll also have some reach out to practice elsewhere and bring this into to the design of your own initiatives. And you've learnt to interpret perceptions and go beyond the loudest voices in your stakeholder network. It tends to be a situation where politicians identify priorities and the economic development team or organization identifies the solutions. And you will have some systems in place to deal with a crisis. Now, a dynamic economic development organization will have deep and extensive knowledge of practice locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally, and an ability to analyze evidence in depth and create their own sources of information capture and apply the lessons and learning to their own services, strategies, and priorities. You will have deep networks and understand stakeholder positions well. Overall, you'll be creative, curious, you'll look at lessons from elsewhere, and you'll be able to translate them to your locality. Dynamic, great economic development organizations are also very well networked, usually internationally, and participate in international conferences and events and share information and have great relationships. And you're able to think in a systematic, long term way. You're able to offer long term solutions and options, but also you will deliver in the short term to win hearts and minds. And politicians will tend to defer to the experts in your organization. Dealing with change and challenge is really built into the DNA of your economic development organization. So, just to recap what we've talked about, Today, we've talked about some definitions. What is local economic development? Why should we be concerned because of all the economic disparities over the very long term? A brief history of the UK political economy, some common issues we encounter in local economic development, how we need to go beyond orthodox economics and often stitch together different economic tools and theories. And we've talked about competency in economic development. Hey, so thanks for listening. Just to let you know that this is part of a series of videos and podcasts about local economic development. There are 16 episodes ranging from topics such as the principles of economic development to the UK's history of local and regional economic development to the main economic development functions such as strategy, enterprise, inward investment, innovation, and labour markets. So these videos will be released over the next few months, and you will have reminders if you sign up for the mailing list. And you can find details on the YouTube and website links below. Thank you. So please remember to give the videos a like if you think they're useful and you think other people would benefit.